Welcome back to OLC Live. I'm John Stewart, and we're here in Nashville, Tennessee for the OLC Innovate 18 conference. We're here at Opryland, and I've got our guest speaker right now is Jordan Shapiro, the keynote speaker for the conference, one of the keynotes. And Jordan works on a wide variety of fields that are pertinent to us, from games and gamification, concepts of time is what he's been talking about here at OLC Innovate 18 this year, and how we can rethink how we're using time in the classroom to better adapt to our modern environment, to our milieu. So I wanted to start off by getting you to introduce this concept of drip time and drip engagement and what that means, and see if you can explain it for the audience.
Yeah. So put simply, so the keynote that I delivered yesterday, I spent a lot of time talking about time and thinking about the way we experience time, and I guess the main thrust of it is the way we tend to organize most of the structures of the education process is into units of time. What I think of it as episodic units of time, right? So we have class. History class starts at 8:45, and then science starts at 10:30, and then we go one class after another. And what we end up doing is we end up teaching kids to put all of their ideas then into these measured units, okay, into these measured units of time. And the question becomes whether or not that makes any sense, right? Does it make any sense to try to fit an idea into a measured unit of time? Because most of the time, when I'm walking down the street, I'm thinking of a million different things. A real idea, when I come up with an idea, like the idea to give that keynote about time, it takes weeks of constant, I think some days I write about it, some days I think about it, some days I read about it, some days an idea pops into my head. It really kind of disperses over a long period. And so the argument that I was making in the keynote was that the reason we've put everything in episodes is because it made sense within the economic and technological paradigms of the past, right? A friend of mine who works at a major textbook company, he said he's a son of a minister, and he said when I was a kid, we had to learn. I had to go to church every Sunday because my dad was the minister. And one of the things that you learned in church is you learned how to sit there and look like you were paying attention, even though you weren't listening, so that you could, at the end of the day, when you got to dinner, have heard just enough that you'd be able to answer the question. When Dad turned to me and answered the question, he said, that's pretty much what we're teaching in schools, is we teach all the students how to sit there and listen to the whole class, but only enough so that they could answer a question and make it sound like they were listening when it gets to the end. Well, one of the reasons is because it's really hard to focus on something for an hour. And I'm not sure it's a benefit to focus on something for an hour. It's certainly a benefit to have focused thoughts. Certainly a benefit to have organized thoughts. It's certainly a benefit to be able to hold a thread of an idea across a long period of time. But in a world with so much connection, in a world of Twitter, in a world of Facebook, in a world where so many things are happening so fast and in a sort of multitasking kind of way, the real challenge is going to be able to hold that link from one drip to another, not to be able to hold it in a 40-minute period. Even most meetings these days, if you go into a board meeting, they're all over the place, right? You don't talk about any one thing for one moment, and yet you have to keep all of those ideas tied together. So in some ways, I'm arguing for more focus but less episodes.
Yeah. Do you see any examples of schools that have abandoned that 40-minute blocks, the bell structure of a classroom, or even the 4 or 5 classes per semester in the 16-week semesters? Is there anyone who's really playing with that time that you admire?
So actually, it's a great question, because it allows me to put this in more practical terms and realize that it's not nearly as extreme as you imagine when you hear me talk about drip versus episodic focus. The example where I've seen the best adjustment to changes in technology, changes in economy, and it is related to time, although not directly, explicitly because of the time that they've gotten here, is when I was in Basque Country visiting schools. Basque Country is between France and and Spain. It's both of them. It's the oldest indigenous people in Europe. They have a language that's not related to the Indo-European languages at all. It's lasted forever. And they're sort of, I went there because I was fascinated. Their schools are very successful. Bilbao is in Basque Country, and I was in Bilbao. I was fascinated because there are people that are so very, very, very deeply, they have a deep sort of, I was going to say national identity, but it's not, they're not really a nation. So it's more cultural identity, right? Or they think they're a nation. Yeah. Spain doesn't think they're a nation. There's all this question about what they are. But either way, they have a very, very strong, meaningful sense of identity. And yet they're also able to contribute to a global world, right? That identity is not based on isolation. It's not based on tribalism. It's based on being able to contribute and have a sort of pride of self, which I think is really important for all of us. Yeah. So I went to their schools and I wanted to see how they were doing it. And this to me was already a question to time in some ways, because I'm sort of like, how are you adjusting to new models? How are you fitting something that's so old and so meaningful and so valuable into completely different way of thinking about the world? And what I saw was, for example, I went into the elementary schools, many of their hallways and public areas and even the classrooms have been remodeled so that they looked like WeWorks almost. And they actually had signs that said, these are co-working spaces, right? And the kids were working independently often, right? They would come together sometimes, but a lot of their work was designed independently across grades, across disciplines, and they would work, you and I might be sitting here with a 3D printer working on something. People over there on the other side of the room might be doing something completely different, but related to the same idea. All of them had to be related. I then went to a university there, Mondragon University, I think is where I saw this. And it was an entrepreneurship program. They didn't even have classes, okay? There was no such thing as classes at this place, okay? They were all divided into teams, like business teams. Yeah. And what would happen is the teams had had projects that they worked on throughout the entire semester. So I kept going, okay, so when am I going to see like a classroom? And then I realized, oh, they never have classrooms. The teachers, the professors, I don't know what the instructors, they sat at a table in the front of a big room that, again, looked like just an office building. And they were there to answer questions and to curate drip experiences. They would occasionally welcome and go, I know you're working on this, so I brought you guys these ideas. Do you want to hear more about it now, or do you want to just take the book? Yeah. Right. And so that was already sort of a curation of drip. They're certainly facilitating and guiding, those instructors were facilitating and guiding an intentional curriculum, an intentional trajectory. It may have looked like it was very informal, but it was much more directed than it appeared. It was just delivered in a drip mentality rather than in the episodic mentality. And that's the problem. We often think that anything that's not delivered in this episodic mentality is informal and superficial. Yeah. Right? We think that it's not planned, right? It's sort of like, I don't know, you think about like the classic, any of the classic jam bands, right? Right? Like you sort of think, oh, they're just sort of being informal. No, they just don't do everything in a 3-minute song. It's very carefully
they're structured. Yeah. And when I was listening to you talk yesterday, I was thinking about project-based learning and about how that's incorporated these ideas since Dewey. Exactly. And I mean, at Oklahoma State, I know in their engineering program, they have cohorts that move through, and they take a set number of classes at a time, but the classes are all sort of a package of a big project, and you'll rotate through roles based on which classes you're in. But you're not really in those classes. You're just adopting different roles and getting some different resources and representing different parts of this engineering project, whether it's program management or design or structure testing or whatever. But yeah, it's that idea of it looks free form, but there's still content, there's still delivery. Yeah. And maybe more towards that drip mentality.
Of course, and there's no reason for all of those mini courses to be the same size either, right? It made sense for them to be the same size when we had to fit them into file cabinets on 3x5. When we couldn't do grading in minuscule pieces. We can do micro grading now because the computer does all the grading anyway, right? I mean, we actually evaluate, but the computer can do all the math, right? It made perfect sense that at one point they were like, everything needs to fit into 50-minute periods and semesters. Imagine if I told you one semester, imagine if we told the administrators, right? One semester you're gonna have 2 credits, the next one you're gonna have 43.1, right? It would be impossible, but it's not hard to do with the computer, right? It's easy. And we still do all these things that are sort of bound by the logic of the file cabinet and the clock that we don't need to do anymore.
you see that the idea of micro-assessment, micro-grading, fitting into micro-credentialing, fitting into sort of gamification of classrooms, the rethinking of whether it's grades or whether it's the motivation, internal and extrinsic, that students are doing. But do you see gamification sort of playing well into this idea of drip engagement?
It can. I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think so much of what we talk about, the possibilities, I see a lot of the limitations in terms of the possibilities of getting to the kinds of project-based or game-based full curricula that we're talking about are really the lack of data points, the lack of assessment points. Some things like micro-credentialing are going to do huge things for that once we move to those kind of things, right? Yeah. Of course, we still need to keep track of things like grades and credentials, right? You can't get informal, as we just said in the last point. The place where we're going to be able to turn that turn what looks informal into something that's really intentional is if we have more and more and more plot points. Yeah. And the more plot points that we have, the more we can decide, is that a gamified platform? Is it not a gamified plot point? When you're teaching in a classroom, I'll talk about myself. When I'm teaching in a classroom, look, most of what I teach when I'm teaching in a classroom, I teach a very traditional old school seminar because I have only a few kids in the class, and I can do that, right? And so I often say we need more education technology, but I don't know if we need more in the classroom, because if I have a regular classroom, there's ways to do it that I don't need anything more than myself and the people. We can talk about also how I do online teaching, which is a very different thing. But there's a million points of which I'm assessing the people in the room, right? Probably each person 40, 50 times a day, but I'm not always keeping track of it, right? In fact, I'm rarely keeping track of it, right? Yeah. Mostly I'm using sort of an intuitive mindset, I'm imagining it, which is fine. When you have 12 students, that's possible, yeah. Right? It's not hard to do, which is why great teachers have done it for years. But how do we take all of those points at which great teachers in classrooms are already going, oh, Joey just did X, I can make some sense of it. Timmy just did this, let me put it in this pot. Yeah. When we start to be able to move that into a more acknowledged and transparent sense of those micro-credentialing that's already happening intuitively, then it becomes easy for us to create drips, right? Because we only need to reach all of those points. We don't necessarily need to do them in order. We don't necessarily need to do them consecutively. We don't necessarily need to do them all within a 50-minute period, but we still need to do them, right? There's no part of me that believes, hey, we should be able to just teach reading in 5 2-second drips, right? But I am saying once we identify all those steps between I'm 6 and now I'm reading, right? Then why do they all have to happen in 50-minute chunks?
Yeah. And we talked earlier on OLC Live, I think it was yesterday morning, about the idea of narrative grading, narrative feedback. Sort of the opposite, I think, of what I'm envisioning as a database of multiple plot points and multiple data points, but the same idea of constant formative feedback, constant sort of evaluation. And there are all of these models that have been out there for a while, but it's just a matter of we're so indoctrinated into an A through F grade scale in 50 minutes that we have to break that.
Yeah, narrative grading in some sense it gets to what I'm talking about. Narrative grading, though, I think is often, and I'm a big fan of narrative grading, but what I'm about to say might sound negative. So that's why I want to start by saying I'm actually a big fan of it. My kids mostly from their teachers got narrative grade. They went to schools that used it. And that was something I looked for when I wanted schools. But one of the reasons that works is, again, because you have a brilliant teacher who is intuitively doing all of these non-narrative plot points, right? And they don't have a way of, they don't have a way of giving it to you with check marks for all of them. And not that I'm saying that we need a way to give it with check marks for all of it, but then they're able to give you a narrative, which in a way is sort of saying, so here's sort of a summary of all the check marks I made in my head while working with your child, right? And that's a great, it works fantastically well. Where it doesn't work though, is it doesn't work well for every student. It's not consistent. It's not, and it doesn't work well for every student, often because of teacher shortcoming. Okay, and I shouldn't say teacher shortcoming. No, I take it back. Not teacher shortcoming, because of the fact that teachers are human. Yeah. Okay, right? Because we all have these shortcomings. And I often think about it this way. I'll be I'll be completely honest in a way that most teachers aren't honest right now. There is always a couple kids that I don't like.
Yeah.
Right. And those kids that I don't like in that room, I have to do an enormous amount of soul searching throughout a semester to actually try to reach them, despite the fact that they irritate me.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just true for everyone. This is not, and I do everything I can, and I try to fall in love with every student by the time I'm done in one way or another. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but there's always some you don't like. Well, you know what that means? That means that the one I like, and generally the ones we like are the ones who are most like us. Okay. I don't mean that purely in a narcissistic sense, but the ones who have a similar cultural background to us. They speak using the words we speak. They have similar, they've grown up in families that are like ours. So they have the same kinds of behaviors. They have the same kinds of traditions, those kinds of things. Those are the ones we like immediately. They get a lot of those little tiny intuitive plot points because it's easy, because I feel good every time I look at them. Then there's that one over there that I don't like. And that one I have to work, which means they're probably getting 20% of the plot points as that other one. And that becomes the problem. So that's where I go, the more we can get intentional and honest and meaningful about thinking about those drip plot points, the more we can get more equity, right? The more equity, because then we can go, hey, you know what? I can reach this kid on 20 of the 50 drips that I need to, but maybe someone else needs to reach them on the other 30.
Yeah, and recognizing the internal bias in all of our decisions. And we're talking about sort of small scale classes, the 12-person seminar, the schools that can do narrative learning. How do you scale it up for online teaching? How do you scale it up for larger 300-person lecture halls?
Well, that's part of what I'm saying when I talk about the micro-credentialing and really starting to identify those drip points. Then you can start to do, then you can really start to scale it up. In that sense. And that's really the goal here, because there's no reason to, we don't have to worry about the people who are in 12. The sad fact of the world, not just the United States, but the whole world, is there's plenty of people who have the privilege of the small classrooms, and they're learning fine, and there's nothing wrong with their education, and they're going to be totally fine. The real question is, how do we put that in the hands of more people? But there's no, the privileged in the world, they've never struggled to figure out how to teach their kids to read or to write or to. I say I'm among them. So it's not a hard thing. It's not a hard thing to do, to get for some people. The problem is, how do we get it for more people? And we want to get it for more people because the more of us that get those that learn meaningful, valuable, thoughtful, intentional ways to interact with ideas and interact with languages, whether those languages are spoken languages or math or science, which are also just languages. The more people that can do that and have conversations in that way, the better the world is for all of us, right? That's how we create a peaceful world that's not full of anxiety and doesn't feel like it's about to explode at any minute, and that's where I think many of us feel we are right now, and need to move out of. And the only way we're going to move out of that is by teaching people to have meaningful connections with thoughtful ideas in a scaled way, which is what your question was originally at, but we went on a long circle to get to it.
But what, I guess, to start to wrap up, what makes you optimistic about the success of this? What makes you optimistic about education, about just the world moving forward?
Generally, I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I'm optimistic because I think it's what humans do. It's what we do naturally, is we teach people. From the very beginning, we've been very good at teaching our offspring, whether they're our biological offspring or just the generation after us, teaching them how to take the knowledge and the wisdom and the values and how to transition that into new economic and technological times, new eras, new possibilities. We've always done that. We've done that through so many transitions, right? Transitions into industrialization, but even before that, into different economic models, different political models. The thing that worries me, the only thing that I'm not optimistic, well, I am optimistic about it, but also worried about it, is how do we do that without pain? Because we both have historical models of that, of those kinds of transitions happening peacefully, easily, thoughtfully, and in ways that serve the most possible people. And we also have times when it happened with tons of unnecessary suffering and murder and worse.
Yeah,
right.
The use of utilitarian explanation to justify horrible ends.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, thank you.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
We'll be back in a little while from OLC Live, but for now, thanks.